I'm Ellen Herman, co-director of the Wayne Moore Center for Law and Politics. I'm delighted to see you all here in person and very, very happy that the Wayne Moore Center is now, inching back into the three-dimensional world with in-person events. Very happy to have all of you who are joining us remotely from your homes or wherever you are. The mission of the Wayne Moore Center is to promote civic engagement, inclusive democracy, and justice by bringing students, scholars, activists, policymakers, and members of diverse communities, people just like you, together. We discuss a wide range of issues affecting Oregon, our nation, and the world, and we work in the tradition of Oregon Senator Wayne Morse, who believed that political independence and education were the building blocks of justice and democracy. He thought that a long time ago, but it is all the more relevant, I think, today. If you're already on our mailing list, that's great. If you aren't and you'd like to hear about future events in our Making Work series, or just to keep up with the activities of the Moore Center, you can do that on the table right outside the door, or you can go to our website and type your name in right at the bottom of the home page. There are just a couple of additional events coming up in the near future that I thought I would mention. On October 8th at 7 p.m. in 175 Knight Law Center, we will have a panel discussing a new report titled A State of Immigrants, A New Look at the Immigrant Experience in Oregon. It was coordinated by our own Labor Education and Research Center, scholars from U of O, a couple of whom are in the room right now, from OSU and Portland State, all contributed, and it's a really interesting new report. They'll be discussing that. On November 9th at 6 p.m. in Ford Alumni Auditorium, we will have a talk by Alan Coburn and Karthik Ramakrishnan about their new book, Citizenship Reimagined, Race, Immigration, and the New States' Rights. So put that on your calendar, or just remember to look up the details on the Wayne Moore Center website. Now, the event you have come for this evening is part of our new theme titled Making Work Work. We'll be exploring this theme during this and the next academic year. We are also very proud that this talk, Nicole Mason's talk, is part of this year's African American Workshop and Lecture series, a wonderful series that has been done for many years here at the University of Oregon. And last but definitely not least, it is this year's Margaret Halleck Program for Women's Rights. Margaret Halleck, we are honored to have her joining us. And not only is she here with us, but I want to tell you just a few things about her, because in case you don't know, without her, we literally would not be here. Margaret Halleck is the founding director of the Wayne Moore Center for Law and Politics. She's an economist who taught at U of O, served as Oregon's senior economist, and worked as director of research for the Oregon Public Employees Union before returning to U of O to direct the Labor Education and Research Center between 1988 and 2001. She also worked for the Service Employees International Union 503, where she led the struggle for pay equity for women workers. She served as a policy advisor to Governor Ted Kulongoski for labor, revenue, and workforce development, and since her retirement in 2015, she has served on the board of sponsors. If you're local, you may know that that is a marvelous, really path-breaking re-entry organization, as well as Planned Parenthood Advocates of Oregon. She still watches over us at the Moore Center and devotes her time and energy to us, for which we continue to be incredibly grateful. So thank you, Margaret. And thank you also briefly to our co-sponsors, to the Office of the President and the Division of Equity and Inclusion, as well as the Center for the Study of Women in Society, and also my wonderful colleagues at the Wayne Moore Center, Rebecca Dinwoody, Abby Stilley, Dan Titchener, and Christine Waite. One last little piece of advertising before I introduce our marvelous speaker, which is that we are especially grateful to members of the Wayne Morse Circle. Some of you out there in the audience, I know, are members of this important group. Circle members provide critical support for all of our programs through annual donations in any amount, small, medium, and large. So please consider supporting our work by becoming a Wayne Morse Circle member if you aren't already. And now it's really a pleasure and an honor to say a few words about Nicole Mason. Nicole Mason is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, which is an incredibly important think tank in Washington, D.C. It has been producing influential research for more than 30 years about critical issues such as the gender wage gap, employment discrimination, and access to education and childcare, and that is just the beginning of a long list. These were urgent matters when the Institute for Women's Policy Research was founded, and they remain very urgent matters for women, children, and families. In fact, the New York Times today, if any of you saw it, reported on the shrinkage of the labor market last month in September, something that happened despite predictions to the contrary, and the disappearance early in the pandemic of women from the labor force and the ongoing challenges of childcare are among the many key factors cited in that reporting just today. Well, Nicole Mason has for two decades been spearheading research on issues related to poverty, to women's economic security, their political participation, their relationship to entitlement reforms, retirement, as well as racial equity. Prior to her role at the Institute for Women's Policy Research, Mason was the executive director of the Women of Color Policy Network at New York University's Robert F. Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. At the very start of the pandemic, Nicole Mason coined the term she-cession to describe the disproportionate impact of the employment and income losses on women. Mason is also the author of Born Bright, A Young Girl's Journey from Nothing to Something in America, and she has written literally hundreds of articles on women, poverty, economic security, and the many other issues that you came to hear her talk about this evening. So please help me in welcoming her to the Moore Center and the University of Oregon.
Thanks, Ellen. I'm really excited to be here and to be your first speaker as the campus opens up. And this is actually my first big work trip, my first big work talk. So this, we're here together. So I do lead the Institute for Women's Policy Research, and as Ellen said, we've been for 30 years doing research at the intersections of gender and the economy. For about 30 years, or at least 25, we were the only think tank in the US doing that kind of research. And I started in 2009, and it was, just imagine taking over after a very strong founder. And I was the first woman of color in the role, and I had a lot of work to do. And so at the end of the year, I remember thinking, December 2019, oh my God, this has really been a tough couple of months. I think I've seen everything you can see, in a leadership transition. And then about a couple months later, I get a global pandemic. I was like, this is on brand for my life. So I feel very humbled to be leading IWPR, in this moment, and I don't take for granted the platform that I have to deliver timely research and to lift up the experiences and the lives and communities I care so deeply about, because I believe that what we say and what we do in this moment really matters. I want to start out by talking a little bit about who I am and how I got to the Institute for Women's Policy Research. So I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California by a single mom. I lived in my community and hadn't been out of it. And so I assumed that everything that was happening in my community, my experiences with episodic homelessness, often my first meals of the day were in the school cafeteria. I assumed that that was normal. And it wasn't until I left for college the first time on an airplane to Howard University that I learned that not everybody lived the way that I lived in my community and with my family. I was taking a political science class, and it was there that I learned about social inequality, poverty, entitlement programs, and many of those programs, like Head Start, I had benefited from as a child. But instead of shrink in my seat, what I did was lean in and decided that this was the work that I was going to do and to lift up the communities and families that I cared so deeply about. When I graduated, I founded a fledgling nonprofit organization, and I was going to make big policy change. And it was running that organization that I met Heidi Hartman, the president and CEO of the Institute for Women's Policy Research. And she was the first person to offer me the opportunity to speak on the Hill about Black women and pay equity. And it was fitting that about 2 decades later, it really took that long, that I would be stepping in and taking on her role and her work. And so I owe her a debt of gratitude and really feel like the work that I do at the Institute for Women's Policy Research was the work I was meant to do, and is a perfect mix of my passion, but also my commitment to helping to shape policies in a way that's reflective of the people who are most impacted. So I wanted to start out there so you know a little bit about me, because I believe that my experiences and what I know about women is what has influenced my work in this moment. I also want to start out with 2 other stories, because I really do believe that stories are the shortest bridge between 2 people, in the way that you get to know a person without knowing the full of who they might be. So I want to start out by sharing a story about when I went to a wedding last year in the middle of the pandemic. So I was traveling to Las Vegas, Nevada, to a small family wedding. And while I was there, I was speaking to a relative who had been laid off from her job working at a restaurant in one of the mega casinos. And she had been with the company for about 20 years. And in March, without notice, she was laid off. In speaking with me, she relayed her fear of not being able to find a job or to return to work. She was a single mother and raising a son. She was drawing unemployment and depending on that income to support her family, but kept repeating to me that she wanted to return to work as soon as possible. Buried underneath her desire to get back to work is that she didn't want to be seen as living off the system. Hearing that, I stopped her and I said, "You gave 20 years to this company. You showed up faithfully and you worked, and there's no shame in having to collect support for a situation that is out of your control and out of your hands." She nodded her head. Part of her fear, though, is not knowing when it would end, how long she would be out of work. She was not the only one who lost her job, and most of her coworkers and friends had lost theirs too. She was also worried about her ability to take care of her son. Now, she did return to work recently, nearly 2 years later, at the same casino. They rehired her back as things began to reopen. I myself am a single mother by choice to 12-year-old twins who just returned to middle school. So if you can remember middle school, you know it was full of anxiety and newness. Lockers, you have the ability to switch your classes, new friends, and trying to fit in. But last year was really different. They transitioned to middle school in the middle of the pandemic. And our family really struggled. About 3 weeks into the term, I received a call from one of the teachers letting me know that they were failing most, if not all, of their classes. I was incredulous and confused. I was in the other room and checked on them throughout the day. I wondered, how could this be happening? But I wasn't just in the other room, I was also working. I was working from 6 in the morning until late in the evening, and they, for the first time, were expected to juggle 6 new teachers, 3 learning platforms, stay engaged, and complete all their assignments on time. And I felt like I was failing them. I remember, it's not even in the speech, but one time I was on a break between meetings, and I was looking for my daughter, and she was outside taking a walk. And I said, "What are you doing? You're supposed to be in class." Or my son, who was supposed to be in class, logged on, and then he was downstairs. I said, "What are you doing?" And he was putting on his roller skates to rollerblade in the house. Right, so these are like pandemic stories, you know. And then, you know, what I did was I said, I need to get some help. So I hired someone, an out-of-work young woman, college student, to come in and to support their learning. And it worked, and we were able to finish the term strong. But this was unsustainable. I felt very fortunate to be able to have that support, to work remotely and work for an organization that understood the burdens and barriers women face in the workplace. But I know that that's not the case for most women who were unemployed during the pandemic, especially those who were trying to navigate their way back into the labor market. On their first day of school, I thought about myself as a child and what this virtual experience would have been like for me and my mother, also a single mother. As I said before, often my first meal of the day was in the school cafeteria, and my second was there as well. And we moved around a lot, so I'm doubtful that I would have had a safe, consistent place to learn, or that I would have the internet connection or connectivity that I would have needed to be successful. My teachers would have been frustrated with us, and my mother, who worked outside of the home, would have had trouble trying to manage and juggle both, her caretaking responsibilities and providing for our family. But in this moment, even as we are moving out of the pandemic and the economic downturn, both of these realities coexist. The common thread running through both the story of my relative is that women and families are struggling. They're continuing to struggle and continuing to struggle to regain their economic footing. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So when we are, well, maybe it's because it's my job. I am like gripped and glued to the TV, tuned in to the reconciliation bills, thinking about, are we going to get child care? Are we going to get paid sick leave? What are we going to get? How much are we going to get? But one of the things I know for sure is that when we fail to act at the federal level or to pass legislation we know will make a difference in the lives of women, such as paid sick leave, raising the minimum wage, making the changes to the child tax care credit permanent, and ensuring that everyone has access to high quality health care, the economic lifeline for families are shortened. It's not a political loss for Democrats or Republicans. It directly, in fact, impacts families. It directly impacts families and their ability to survive. This is particularly acute for families headed by women of color who are more likely to be the primary wage earners in their families, have less savings to ride out an economic downturn, and are more likely to work in the industries most impacted by job loss. As you know, COVID-19 has had a devastating impact on working women and their families, and has triggered an economic recession that will have a lasting impact on women's long-term labor force participation and economic well-being, and actually wealth. It also has exacerbated and deepened many of the existing inequalities and disparities, health, income, racial, and exposed many of our failing systems that were not working for many families. So one of the things that I get asked a lot, or we talk about a lot, is, how bad is it? Or is it worse than it was before the pandemic? The truth of the matter is that families that were struggling before the pandemic just exacerbated what they were already experiencing. Women who were struggling with care, it became an impossible burden for them. Women who didn't, many lower wage workers were really without struggling around health care, or didn't have access to high quality health care, but were just making do. We've all heard the statistic that people, when they get sick, they wait until they get really sick and then they end up in an emergency room. And so that's what people were doing for care. But during a global health pandemic, that was unsustainable. People needed immediate care. And we see that the impact of delayed care had severe consequences for workers and families. The 2008 recession, defined by job loss in production and manufacturing, impacted men. At the height of the recession, over 2 years, unemployment never reached 8%. The economic downturn that we're experiencing right now, as you know, is a she-cession, defined by income and job losses in sectors dominated by women: service, leisure, hospitality, education, and healthcare. Since March 2020, the economy has shed more than 40 million jobs, and women have bore a disproportionate amount of those losses. 4 times as many jobs were lost by women as by men. To put this in perspective, at the start of 2020, we were celebrating a significant milestone. Women were 50%, more than 50% at the time of the workforce. The economy was booming, and that boom was made in part by, can be attributed to women. At the time, though, I cautioned about the full embrace or celebration of this milestone. I understood that the numbers masked the struggle that many women were facing to make ends meet or to care for their families. Although women at the time constituted 51% of the workforce, they were also more likely to be in lower wage jobs, have fewer benefits, less job security, and to be economically vulnerable. They also struggled with other caretaking demands. In other words, all was not what it seemed. But we were measuring economic well-being by the stock market, by GDP, but not by the economic security and well-being of women and families. As I mentioned, the chief reason for this is that, in terms of the economic downturn, is that women were more likely to be employed in the hardest hit sectors. But one of the things that we haven't accounted for is the number of women who are employed in the underground economy, the jobs that we don't account for. So we don't account for domestic workers or women who are working under the table. Those jobs don't get counted. And we know that when we have full employment, the jobs that housekeeping, domestic work, service work, that we pay those workers with wages from full-time employment. And so when that disappears, it has an effect on the workers, the most vulnerable workers who don't have protections, who cannot tap into unemployment insurance. In February 2020, the unemployment rate for women was about 4%. And by March of 2020, it was 14%. And for Black and Latina women, the numbers were 16 and 18.9%. Women have never, in the history of this country, even during the Great Depression, experienced unemployment numbers at that rate. Now, today, the unemployment rate has dropped to 4% for all women, but you know what? The unemployment rate for Black and Latino women are still around 8%. And as you recall, I said in 2008, the unemployment rate for all people never reached above 8%, and that was considered a crisis. And so when I think about the recovery, and I think about the disproportionate recovery, I was just listening to the news when I was getting ready today, and they said, oh, well, Oregon is doing well. Unemployment rate is about 4%. No, 5%. The unemployment rate for the nation is around 4%. You know what's going to happen? We're about to turn away from what's happening. And we're going to turn away because the numbers have dropped. But nothing has changed in the lives of the people who are most vulnerable and who have lost a lot, or the most, during this economic downturn. In September 2020, 865,000 women dropped out of the labor force. And I was getting asked, this is September, right? So now, let me tell you something. I was super devastated in August last year when the schools didn't open. I was like, I remember when schools let out in March, I remember saying, I just have to get to the summer. I was just like, I don't care what you do this summer. You can just run around the backyard. I don't care. I just need to get to the summer. And all of my friends who were parents kept saying, we just need to get through this. School's going to open up in August, and we're going to be okay. And that just never happened. And so for families and women who were struggling and managing and juggling childcare, it was really the straw that broke the camel's back when the schools didn't open. Because before the pandemic, women were doing 30% more caretaking work in the home compared to their male counterparts. And when during the pandemic, that work increased, the care work increased. So they were doing double duty. And I have to tell you, in August when the schools didn't open, that was just it. And many women had to make tough choices, earn a living or take care of their families. And the truth of the matter is that it wasn't just the women who, there was a narrative happening around what women were leaving, what women were dropping out of the workforce, who was this 865,000 women. And so there was a dominant narrative going around about it was women who had a partner at home, or who had disposable income or had savings. And that just wasn't the case. It was the lower wage workers, women who were employed in the service sector, who in order to get paid, you have to show up to work. But if you have caretaking responsibilities, whether it's a child or aging parent, you can't do that. So you have to leave the workforce. And so those are the women who were dropping out of the workforce. They made up the 865,000 women workers who had left the workforce. Only about 30% of workers can work remotely. And among women who were able to work remotely, those were the women who were earning higher wages. So again, it set us up for when we think about the recovery, a K-shaped recovery, where people who were doing well and could afford to work remotely, they were able to make it work. But women who were doing poorly before the economy, it just sent them spiraling. And so I'll talk about that in a little bit in terms of what that means in terms of thinking about how we might reimagine a workforce that works for women. So I want to talk a little bit about the impact of the economic downturn on younger women. So for younger women who were less established in the labor market, unemployment was and continues to be high. We don't talk about younger women a lot, and we don't talk about older women a lot when we talk about the economic downturn and its impact on women. Prior to the pandemic, the unemployment rate for younger women was about 5.9%. But during the economic downturn, it was increased to 18%. And what this means when we talk about young women is that delaying the on-ramp to work has a definite impact on their career mobility as well as their long-term earnings. Before I get into what we're going to do, I want to just talk a little bit about those women I was talking about, my mom and other women who are breadwinner mothers. And breadwinner mothers, again, are those women who dropped out of the labor force, or part of that 865,000 women. And breadwinner mothers are those whose income their income makes up about 40% of their household income. So what that means is that when they drop out of the workforce, they drop out of the labor market, the household income decreases significantly. And what it also means is that if they drop out of the workforce, some families have zero income. Black and Latino women are more likely to be, again, breadwinner mothers than other mothers. And it also means that we have to think about the pay gap and all those other economic factors that when women lose their job or income and they don't have savings, again, it causes the family to become more economically vulnerable. Sorry. So there have been fits and starts when it comes to talking about the recovery and when we talk about building the future. I'm not really good at working the slides as I talk. As you can tell, we're still on the first slide. I'm gonna just, go here. We talked about the she-cession, we talked about the jobs, I'm sorry. We talked about all of this stuff. Okay, okay. Where do I, okay. Well, you can read these, but I don't know if they're gonna match what I'm saying, but here we go. So there have been fits and starts to the recovery. So job gains by women, so we've all been thinking about, I get asked now, how are we gonna get out of the she-cession? What's going on? I want to talk a little bit, before I talk about what we're going to do, I want to talk about the power of naming it the she-cession. I'm going to tell you the story of the she-cession. So again, when I came to IWPR, we operated like a sleepy think tank. We did these long studies, like these 2-year studies. We were, our researchers were pretty wonky. And I said, well, I think that's fine, but I think we need to be in the world. We need to be talking about what's happening to women right now. We need to be meeting the moment. And we also need to be thinking about policy change. How does our research translate into real policy change? And how can organizations and legislators use our research to inform how they think about this work? So during the pandemic, when we started to see the numbers, I said, this is it. This is our time. We should get this. We have to get in here. We're seeing something in the data that tells us that women are being disproportionately impacted. And I think we have something to say about it. And it's not only that women are being impacted, it's women of color, it's women employed in specific sectors, leisure, hospitality, those women are being impacted. And the media was calling all of the think tanks, many run by men, asking what was going on. And they get to me, and I say, well, I think we should just call it a she-cession. And I kept saying it in emails and in, when I was writing to people, and nobody was picking up on it. But I was talking to the New York Times, and she said, well, why? I said, because women are losing most of the jobs. It's not men. This is not a recession of production and manufacturing or construction. This is a recession impacting the sectors that women are employed in. And she said, and we got off the phone, and I said, so let's just call it a she-cession, and she printed it. So that's how it happened. But what I want to say is the reason why that's important is because if I had not said it, we would not be talking about the economic downturn in this way today. We would still be figuring out the language for how to talk about the disproportionate impact of job and income losses on women. And when I think about the work of the Institute for Women's Policy Research, it's about also thinking about how we shift the narrative, how do we talk about policy change in these issues in a way where we insert a new framework for thinking about these issues? And that's what the she-cession did. And so now when we think about building an equitable recovery, we understand that you can't do it without centering women, because women were were disproportionately impacted. So how do we think about creating a gender equitable recovery? So let's talk about what is a gender equitable recovery. So a gender equitable recovery works to ensure that those most impacted will be at the center of our recovery efforts, and that the policies that we are seeking are meant to fix systems and structures that weren't working for families or women. So after we are in the throes of, like last year, we're just trying to figure it out. Like we don't know what to call, we don't know what to do. It's right after the election, at which, everybody, at least I thought it was like, something has got to change so that we can try to get to a different place. And so after the election, I started thinking about, well, what should we be doing? How might we contribute and help shape the conversation? And that's where we came up with the idea for the report, because we wanted to not only talk about what was happening in this moment, but talk about the historic disadvantages, the historic inequality, social inequality, economic inequality that made this moment possible. I want to be very clear that the reason that we had to spend trillions of dollars in recovery, in a recovery plan, is because we had no social safety net. The reason why our hospitals were burdened and people were fearful about going to the hospital is because we have a broken healthcare system. The reason we had to pump all those dollars into the unemployment insurance program is because we had a broken unemployment insurance program. The reason we have to pay for, rent moratorium and all those other things is because we don't have a housing system where housing is affordable, especially in cities. So all of the things we were not paying attention to before the pandemic became really, really problematic during the pandemic. And with most things, even with your car, if you don't pay for it now, you're going to pay more for it later. And that's what happened. And so now we're in a moment where we have an opportunity to get it right, to do something different, to create systems and institutions that work for most people, not just the few. And I was thinking about not only how we might fix them, but I think that it's not about tinkering around the edges of policy, like fixing, adding a few $1 billion here or a couple 100,000, $500 million here. These numbers are really big, but some of these systems need to be overhauled. They need to be reimagined. They need to be scrapped and rebuilt from the bottom up. And so thinking about how do we do this? How do we propose we do this? That's where the innovation is. It's not about understanding social inequality. We all understand social inequality. It's about how might we take the problems that we're seeing, the economic, the big gap between, economic security for some versus others, the wealth gap, the income gap, the issues with workers. How do we think about doing it so that we can correct it or correct these issues once and for all? And that just requires a lot of innovation, but it also requires really understanding how we got there. Like, how do we get here where things are so imbalanced, where people are afraid to go to the hospital, people, get declined for unemployment insurance that they're entitled to, or benefits. How do we get there? How do we fix these systems? So one of the things that we did was to help make the case for a lot of the policies that we were talking about in the report, was to commission national surveys to see what people were thinking, women were thinking. We wanted to know, how are you doing? What are the priorities? One of the things we saw is that, of course, like we knew that women were really struggling with childcare. They had stopped working or reduced their hours to meet childcare, even if for a short time. And we found out, which we already knew because we had the research, that childcare was wildly unaffordable. So 30% of families spend 30% or more of their income on care. And I know that firsthand. When I had my twins, I was like, I don't understand why we don't have a revolution. This is ridiculous. Like, childcare is ridiculous. But then I figured it out, and then I went on about my way. But it is, we've never solved that problem. And what we found out, and listening to women, is that they too felt like this was a really big problem. One of the things that also came out when we asked women what the issues were, they talked about health care. They said that health care was their #1 priority, which, again, it's a global pandemic, so that's not really surprising. But they also said that they were having trouble paying the bills. But this wasn't a new problem. This is a problem that has, that had persisted. And they also said they weren't able to take paid sick leave. So again, during a global pandemic, people are afraid of losing their jobs if they have to call off sick, right? There's no job security, especially for lower wage workers or workers who are most vulnerable or during the pandemic became essential. Again, because Black women and Latino women or women of color are disproportionately employed in lower wage sectors, they were disproportionately impacted by the lack of paid sick leave. Oh, I want to show you this one. So when we ask women what their priorities are, and I think this is really important when we think about what got done. So in the first CARES Act, and then the second one when Biden came in. So women across the board said health care was their #1 priority. For Black women, we see that racial justice and inequality was top on their list as well. But for Black and Latino women, you'll see that one of their top priorities was raising the minimum wage, right? And when I remember when the administration came into the office, it was a priority. It was on the agenda. Raising the minimum wage was on the agenda. And we knew that this is what people wanted, because we asked them, we said, what is your priority? They said raising the minimum wage. The thing that has fallen off the agenda over the last several months is raising the minimum wage. And the minimum wage, I want to be very clear, is not a living wage, it's a minimum wage. And it also doesn't include any benefits or the other things that we know make the difference or would have made the difference for women during this economic downturn. So I want to talk a little bit about what do we need? I really love what's happening at the federal level. Well, I was more optimistic, I have to say, in the beginning of the administration. I used to wear the shirt that said, good things are coming. But now I don't know if they're coming. Because what we need is not what we're going to get. Right? We need all of these things. We need higher wages. We need a national child care system. We need paid sick and family leave. We need to rebuild the social safety net. We need continued economic impact payments. We need quality jobs. These are all the things that we know that we need. The pandemic has showed us that we need, but somehow it seems like it's really precarious, that we don't know if we're really going to get those things. There's a proposal at the federal level, that would make it, sorry, excuse me. There's a proposal at the federal level, which we advocated for, to make it so that no family pays more than 7% of their income on child care, right? And that child care is high quality child care is available across the country, treating child care as a public good rather than a private obligation of families. That sounds amazing. But you know, and it's not like we haven't done it before. If women enter the workforce in the US at the same rate as women in Norway who do have subsidized child care, it would add $1.6 trillion to the GDP. So this is not like, you know, a nice to do thing. It's actually good for the economy, and it's actually good for women and families, especially when we think about career mobility. But somehow, it doesn't look like it's gonna pass. And not that we don't have a lot of work to do. Like 7% across the board means a lot of different things to different families. Like 7% of my income is different than 7% of someone else's income. So addressing issues of equity is going to be really important as we think about it. But reimagining a system where we do treat childcare as a public good, like the same way we treat roads and bridges and parks that everybody has access to, is not crazy talk. We're the only developed country that doesn't have a robust subsidized childcare structure. The US spends less than 1% of its GDP on childcare. We're only behind Turkey and Ireland in our expenditures. So, you know, the floor is pretty low. I mean, raising the minimum wage will lift 50% of lower wage workers out of poverty. You know, all of these things have economic benefits over the long term. But somehow, they seem out of reach and almost impossible. And so one of the questions I ask is like, why does that? Like why, I mean, like literally we're kind of like, well, maybe we'll get a little bit of this. Or, you know, as somebody said, maybe you can have one out of the three things. You just need to pick one thing. So, you know, this guy. So, I don't know. So, I want to talk about just a couple more things, and I'm going to, this opportunity to reimagine work. Like, how do we do that? So, the pandemic has forced all of us in our professional and private lives to rethink work. For women, it brought to life many of the conversations we'd been having in private about work-life balance and childcare, and made those conversations public. So for the first time, women in the C-suite and women working in grocery stores understood that being unable to do it all was less about your will and capacity and more about institutions and structures that were failing us. And it wasn't our fault. The other thing that we learned during the pandemic is that work could happen anywhere and at any time. For so long, asking for workplace flexibility seemed like an accommodation and was off the table at most companies, especially if you wanted to advance in your careers. And during the pandemic, flexibility became a necessity. And we started to organize our work around our lives instead of the other way around. So now we are in a different moment, a moment that wasn't possible 2 years ago. And we have an opportunity to imagine workplaces that work for most workers and for women. We also have an opportunity to examine our workplace models and practices. And we can also begin by starting to ask about how our workplace models help and support working mothers and families. We can also ask how might it be hurting them. And I'll give you an example about what I'm talking about. So about 15 years ago, millennials were beginning to enter the workforce. You remember the conversations when millennials were entering the workforce? Now we're on to Zers, so you know, millennials seem so passé. There's just nobody cares about millennials anymore. But when we did, there were a lot of conversations about what millennials needed to what we needed to do to make the workplace more accommodating to millennials, right? So there was all these articles about like, what do they like? What do they need? So there was like, oh, they like ping pong. They like games. So give them a little break room, They like to be dressed casually. So, but they also like work-life balance. So don't work them too hard, So, so all these articles were written about millennials, but more importantly, businesses transformed to make millennials, to accommodate them. So there were whole campuses built around these new workers. But the truth of the matter is, when I think about it, that accommodation, that thinking about how to accommodate women in the workplace never happened. Women for the last 50 years have been at least, ebbing and flowing between, 47 and 51% of the workforce. There's not been one article written until recently about what women need to be successful in their careers. Like if you would have asked me, I would have been like, you can put a child care center, down here, I'll never leave. You can do, there's just like so many great things, you could have done to make me happy. But we still operate like a very Mad Men 1950s workplace model. It's a very masculine model. It's never changed to accommodate women. Women were supposed to just deal with it. The long hours, deal with it. Sexual harassment, deal with it. All of these things, we were just supposed to deal with it. And on top of that, do our caretaking responsibilities and work. So I think this conversation about why this work isn't working for most people, it definitely isn't working for women. And so now we have to create a new narrative, a new model to start thinking about, well, then what would work? What should change? And so I am excited about that conversation, the conversation that we're having that is overdue, if you ask me. And I'll give you an example just about my job. We have women, women. I don't have a lot more time. What time is it? It's time. Okay, so this is a really good story. At the beginning of the pandemic, we worked with mostly women, moms, and we had a child care FSA plan, but we didn't have any other thing for child care. And we're a small nonprofit, and I said, well, why don't we do a child care subsidy where we will subsidize annually, we give mothers or families $4,000 towards care. So whether it's elder care or child care, they have $4,000 to support care. And we made it a permanent benefit that families can tap into. Now, that little gesture transforms how women relate and think about work. I know for me, for example, I have to travel overnight. I'm here right now, traveling overnight for work. I'm a single mom, I have to pay for overnight care. So for a lot of my career, I was literally paying to go work. And so by adding the $4,000 subsidy that's accessible to all workers, I no longer have to pay for work. That is what I mean by making and changing and transforming the workplace model so that it can work for women and for all workers. And that's just one example, and many other companies are doing the same thing. So the last thing I want to talk about, and I love it because it's about labor and work. So you've all heard about the Great Resignation, right? Everybody's like, oh my God, it's a Great Resignation. Nobody wants to work. Oh my God, they're just having a good time with no money, right? So, like 4 million people have resigned from their jobs. And there's a frame that employers have said, oh, well, they're just not working because of the benefits that everybody's getting. So cut those off and we'll get the workers back. Guess what? They cut the benefits out, they didn't come back. Why? Because those are crappy jobs. Why? Because we've had this time to really think about what works for me, And so instead of calling it and thinking about it as a great resignation, I think a new frame is the great renegotiation. Workers are renegotiating work, their relationship to work, their relationship to employers, and it's also forcing employers to, again, examine their workplace models, examine their practices, examine their treatment of workers. Again, before I came here, I was reading an article where employers were having to rethink the way that they allow customers to speak to workers. And saying like, well, obviously if customers are going to abuse our employees, we can't stand for that because they're leaving. But again, it's about renegotiating, rebalancing, and I really love that this moment that we're in, that workers are, it's not a strike. In some instances, there is a strike, but it's an opportunity for workers to really use their voice and their power, which we do have a lot of, to reshape and rethink work. So I'm really optimistic about this moment. I'm really enjoying this moment that we're in. I really hope that we are able to keep this momentum up and turn this corner and really build an economy that works for everyone, that's fair, equitable, and just. And I'm really happy to be working alongside you and people who are listening to be able to do that really important work. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicole. Very optimistic ending. I hope we are in a period of the great renegotiation. Everybody seems to be promising that workers now have the upper hand because of the reconsideration. And you know, even more aspirational, the reimagination of what the workplace might be. I know that the last 18 months has certainly drawn a great deal of attention to the terrible crises facing the most vulnerable workers, women among them, but I hope we will be able to use this, I hope it is a positive moment, to get some traction toward not just addressing those crises of child care and minimum living wages and so on, but really get somewhere with policymakers. So I will invite you. We have a microphone right here for anybody who would like to pose a question to Nicole Mason. Margaret, it seems fitting that you would be the first questioner, so please go right ahead.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and I agreed with the whole thing, and I kept thinking about the great resignation, and thank you for ending, because that's, I made a vow to myself that I wasn't going to read anything that didn't improve my mental health, and so it's been slim pickings out there to be able to, you know, to follow the news, but the great resignation has me also optimistic. The pandemic, you're so right, it's an accelerant for all of the inequalities laid bare, all of those inequalities, and especially the crisis in our care economy. But I'm optimistic, but I can't
actually think you're right. And like you said, our research shows that women who belong to unions earn higher wages, have more job security, but also face less discrimination. And I do think that it's really tough to, again, one-on-one negotiation. And so I'm really looking forward to the reemergence of unions. Liz Schuler is now the new president of AFL-CIO. She's amazing, and so I'm just really, Is she? She's amazing. She's on our board. So I do think there's a role for unions to play, and as you know, unions have weakened over the last couple of decades. So, what I'm really hoping, and I hope this for women, but I hope this for workers, is that we don't see it as individual problems or a problem that each of us have to solve, but understand it as an institutional, structural problem that requires a collective and structural response. So that's what I'm hopeful about.
Thank you. So I love the idea of national child care. I'm worried about American people being willing to pay for it. How's that look?
Well, it's just, I really think that, the budget should reflect our priorities and our values, and right now it just there's not great alignment. If there was a time when we did subsidize child care nationally, and we did it because it was for the national good, right? It was for the war, and then we didn't. Then we just stopped. We just stopped. And then when we were still advocating for the continuation of national care, President Nixon cut it. He said, what did he say? It wasn't an argument, it wasn't an economic argument, it was a family values argument. And so, because we know that the economic argument for subsidized child care is a winning one. It increases GDP, it could, keeps women in the labor force, it leads to, higher productivity. Whatever, if you want to talk about capitalism work stuff, But the truth of the matter is that the only people who lose out, the only people who benefit for us not having a child care structure are not women, but it's actually men. I just want to be honest, because, and I say that because, even during the pandemic, when women were struggling with childcare, men were getting promoted in jobs. Women weren't getting hired at the same rate. So, and it maintains really very toxic patriarchal, hierarchies in order. So, and the thing about it is that we're subsidizing the child care system with unpaid labor of women of color. They're the ones who are bearing the brunt of not paying livable wages to child care workers. And we're subsidizing big companies. So I just really think it's a question of priorities. And I don't understand why can't we think about child care in the same way we think about roads. I don't drive on roads every day. I've never been to a lot of national parks, but my tax dollars pay for them. So.
Hi, thank you. I'm a 3L here in the law school, and I actually have a master's in public policy, and this is my jam, so I just want to say thank you, and thank you to the Wayne Moore Center for bringing you in. I also spent last summer on the Hill, thanks to the Wayne Moore Center in a fellowship, and heard a lot of exactly these narratives that you're talking about. And so I guess my not fully formed question is around your organization's sort of theory of change and what we do with this, because I feel very frustrated that there's a lot of economic arguments that are sound and irrefutable to making these changes, but it's like we lose out on almost a PR battle to making that change. And whether it's more of a grassroots approach the organization is taking, you know, I was interested that you said, oh, we were kind of a sleepy, put out a report every couple of years organization before, which I think there's a long history of think tanks doing that with, you know, arguable amounts of change. So are you instituting a new approach or policy in your organization that you see gaining traction? Is it really just, you know, you're not there yet because we are living in this moment and you're just throwing everything out that you can? Like, I'm just curious about how this is going for you, because I think a lot of what you're saying and a lot of your approach resonates with things that make sense to me, but I haven't seen a lot of organizations doing them.
Well, you know, it was going better probably a couple months ago. I mean, I think we were more optimistic. Like I really thought we were just gonna get in there and get all this stuff passed, and then, you know, it's really precarious. I think in terms of our theory of change, well, I think I have two things, right? I think we have to do narrative change because shifting narratives and attitudes will lead to public policy change. Like if you think about any public policy changes or shifts, major ones over the last year, it has happened because of narrative and attitude change, like even same-sex marriage, anything, right? So these attitudes around childcare, women's roles, where they should be, power, is connected to whether or not we should be able to get, you know, and have subsidized federal childcare. So narrative change is a big one. I actually think, and we are starting to do more of it, is I really believe that to accelerate any conversation around closing the pay gap, you know, any of the things we're talking about, we have to accelerate women's power and influence, build women's power and influence in society. Because you know what, and this, I mean, I'm in Oregon, so you know, but the truth of the matter is every time people are like, well, why haven't we passed these things? I'm like, why are you asking me that? You know that it's because white men in Congress, like, let's just be honest here. You know, like, that's who's, if you want to really get down to the brass tacks here about what's happening, you know, about we are there, we have the case, we have the economic case. I mean, we just ran for Build Back Better. We said, oh, okay, well, you know, if we do this, it'll save families $965 billion over 10 years in care expenses, right? So we're running the numbers because we're, you know, we show what the numbers, we give them to the White House, they're happy about the numbers, it doesn't go anywhere. But you have to think about who's in power, both at the federal and state levels. So I do think when we change who's in power, we will see real change. That is really
Good evening. Thanks for being here. This is not my jam. I'm a biochemistry professor. But I'm interested in these things. Some of the graphs you showed were talking about immigrant women being affected. And I want to just make sure I understand exactly what you're talking about. Is it non-permanent residents that we're talking about? Are these actually citizens? And if they aren't, is the number of women being affected actually bigger than what you are saying because maybe they aren't part of the census and how they're being included in the data?
Yes, absolutely. So when we think about women, so both, you know, I'm talking about undocumented women. Like, for example, undocumented people were excluded from the first CARES Act. And you know, so, and then we talk about the women who are undocumented who work in the underground economy, who we don't see, right? So our unemployment rate is probably much higher because we're not counting people,
So rolling with that theme, what I'm thinking is lots of different aspects of the economy. But I wonder if you bring a policy forward and it says we need to bring like social help to immigrants, that some people's response may be, we shouldn't help immigrants, we should be helping Americans. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't help immigrants, I think that's really good, but I'm wondering if when you're saying immigrants, it's actually citizens that you're talking about, or people that are kind of coming over the border and working in agriculture in California and then coming back. And if it really is immigrants that are more transient, then I'm wondering if like fewer people are just going to get behind it at a national level because they're going to think that we're helping other people outside of the country, and if that somehow becomes counterproductive, even though we want to, help everybody.
The truth of the matter is that people, most legislators, even Democrats, think the way that you think. So undocumented immigrants do get kind of cut out of, national policies or efforts. But undocumented people pay taxes and contribute. So excluding them from services that, are vital, they're here, so it's not like you're not moving them out. So when I think about this, I'm thinking about what is the highest good, right? And so how we might help the most people. And so the scarcity framework around, well, these people are deserving. These people are undeserving. I think it just doesn't work, because I think we can all, and even any of these groups, like some people think single moms are not deserving, or moms who have too many kids are not deserving. So there's always a group people are looking to exclude.
Yeah, and it kind of comes back to childcare. Is that people are thinking, well, we don't need to give, you don't need to help people that want to have kids, because I don't want to have kids or something. And it's just like the wrong argument to have. This is very much about me and how everything's going to benefit me, and they don't see the big picture. So,
Yeah. And I don't even need childcare that much anymore.
Good evening. Thank you so much for coming here, for giving up time with your kids to be here and share this work with us. This is totally my jam. I've worked on a lot of these issues over the years here in Oregon. Oregon's doing really well on the policy side, but as you're talking about, a lot of it is culture change too, right? Just having the conversation. And the pandemic has really daylit these issues where we can't not talk about them anymore. Specifically, what I wanted to ask is if you have any sort of promising reports from the field about what local communities can do in terms of policy around affordable childcare, which it has to include paying the childcare providers living wages and their working conditions. I'm a county commissioner. I'm only the 8th woman ever to serve on our county commission here in Lane County, and there are now 2 of us moms on the county commission, and I can tell you the conversations are very different than they were just a year ago. We are talking about childcare, whether our colleagues want to hear it or not. We're talking about the wages for our employees and so on. In a way, we're talking about flexible scheduling and telecommuting post-pandemic. All of these things you talk about, of course, we need them at the federal level for economies of scale, and so we don't leave anyone behind, but I know from my work on things like raising wages and paid sick time and so on, you often need a movement of you need sort of that testing at the local level to create the momentum to, locals to get the states to get the federal policy. So if you have any insights or local-based policies around childcare, affordability and access that we could learn from, I'm all ears. Thank you.
So I think I was talking about this with Ellen. I think Oregon just did a really good thing. I know I talked about it before, but I think that Oregon or is it Colorado? Oh, it could be Colorado. But just passed universal child care, like a small, program. Yeah. And so what has been really great is that there's momentum. So I am one to think that like the federal government is a little bit broke. So like, what did you say?
Broken, not broke.
It's broken. It's broken. And that was a great distinction right there. It's like, it's not broke, it's broken. So, so the states and the localities are the laboratories for real change and for testing some of these ideas. And just like with paid sick leave, there's no paid sick leave at the federal level, but localities and states have been passing their own ordinances, which gives momentum for a federal policy. And frankly, I have to say that's the same thing that happened with same-sex marriage, marijuana legalization, you know, all these things, and then it goes to the federal level when you have different states doing things. So I think that the real experimentation, the real models, the real innovation is happening at the local and state levels. And even, we've been talking a lot about, well, even if we get all of this money coming down from the federal government to the states, we have to think about implementation. Like what's gonna happen? How's the money gonna get from there to the state, to the localities? And so states being prepared or localities being prepared to be able to absorb the influx of dollars, to demonstrate, to meet the needs of families. So that's right.
Well, I'll ask one of Yvette. Go right ahead.
Thank you very much for your talk. Really learned a lot. I have a question about the issue of mental health. Much of what you talked about and what you have featured on this is about how to help women help others. And there's very little work, I think, about how do we help women take care of themselves, not just economically, but in terms of their well-being. Something that you mentioned earlier. I think we're always talking about how do we measure well-being. We often measure it in terms of money. What does it mean to measure well-being in terms of mental health and how women feel about themselves? And just wondering if your institute is doing any work on that as well.
Oh man, we are not. We are not, but I think it's really important, especially the impact of the pandemic. You know, like my children, horrible. Myself, like I was, you know, like how did I even do it? And at the beginning of the pandemic, women kept saying, we can't do this, we can't do this. This is crazy, don't make us do this. You can't do this, no. And we did it, we did it. And then when my kids went back to school, I was like, oh my God, what was I doing? You know, and it wasn't about, you know, my money, my economic security. It was about how was I mentally able to cope? So I think that's really important aspect of this that we haven't talked enough about. But there are some conversations, we just haven't been leading them. But it's really important.
We just have a very few minutes left, and thank you again for all of your thoughts. But I thought I would ask you, since you mentioned it at the beginning, that you're obsessed with the reconciliation bill. And I suspect everybody in the audience is paying close attention to that. So I'm wondering if you have any strategic suggestions for the Democrats at the moment. The choice that I've heard about seems to be either the getting rid of one of the things on the list, which you also mentioned. So today I heard, 2 years of community college gone. Is that the way to go, or is the other way to go is kind of paring back the timeline so that the kinds of services, whether they're caring services, education, and so on, are funded for a shorter window, with the hope that kind of kicking the can down the road will generate a kind of momentum and support that will, support those policies in the future. Anyway, what's your advice to the Democrats?
My advice to the Democrats is to, get rid of 2 of them. And they're there. But so what the big fear is that I think is that, I know, because I think it's true that if you give us a little bit of what we're asking for on childcare, it's a slippery slope to universal childcare, right? We know, some of these things, we know that, if we get a little bit, it's gonna build the public will and open the door for more. So if I were thinking about this, I would go, because it's a 10-year period, right now it's 10 years. So I would cut the time. I would keep the things and cut the time. And then we'll have another bite at the apple. The same thing we're probably going to try to do for child tax care credit. It expires and doesn't expire in a year, or and so we're trying to fight to make that permanent. But people like it; they see that it works. Now there's a narrative emerging. People are crazy. There's a narrative emerging about do you think people should work for the child care tax credit? It was what are you talking about? This is a tax credit. But again, it gets into the frame. They're putting it into the welfare reform frame, and it becomes demonized, and it's a tax credit, but it's working. So, but what I do think is that what's really amazing, I think, with the reconciliation bill is that women's advocacy organizations, or all kinds of organizations, are doing so much amazing groundwork to educate people about what it is. Because I don't think regular people think about reconciliation and all those things. There's a rally on Thursday around care, but around getting these things passed. So that's what I would do. I think if we do 1 of 3, or we get, it's gonna be hard to put that thing, just like minimum wage. They dropped minimum wage out of the CARE Act, it's off the table. It would take so much to get minimum wage back on the table. If you cut programs that that are gonna do what we're asking to do, it's gonna be really hard to bring it back and get it back on the table.
I hope you're right, and I hope they pay attention to your advice. Thank you all so very much for coming, and thank you very, very much, Nicole Mason, for those really interesting, insightful, and important thoughts about what it will take to have a gender-equitable recovery. Again, I hope we will see you at a future in-person event. We're all making our way in this kind of new world of in-person, and for all of you out there who are watching your computer screens, we're very glad that you joined us as well. So thanks again.